Hello, I'm Joseph Carlson, and this is episode 34 of The Grief of Politics.
Yes.
I'm joined once again by Avin Carroll.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, it was your month to pick this time.
Yes.
So you talked about it the end of last month's podcast. Why did you pick this, and to bring people up to speed?
So, you actually talked to me a little bit about it, and I actually thought, that probably would be an interesting topic for us to go over, because you had brought up that you'd seen an article about people just aren't going back to church or are leaving church. And not long before that, I had talked to you about another article I had read in the Atlantic by Russell Moore, so it's going to be one of the ones that we actually highlight here, about just crisis within the church.
He's a pastor as well, right?
Former pastor.
Yeah.
And sat on the board with the Southern Baptist Convention.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't anymore. I believe now he's working for a publication called Christianity Today.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's still there. But I thought it would be a really interesting topic to kind of talk about, like, where are we at as a country? And then as I started reading the article you sent, and then the next article I found, I was, like, really astounded, and it resonated with me a lot, probably similar to things that I've already said on the podcast.
Yeah.
So I thought it'd be a good topic.
It was, for me, it really is the grief of politics, because, you've talked to me privately and then reading these articles about, people go to church for a community, and, I don't know why I'm saying all this. I mean, you actually go to church, so you could say why people go to church. But it's the idea that you think it's one thing, but it seems like it's turning into another thing, especially reading these articles. So it's like, maybe you want to have, from my sense, it's like maybe you want guidance, maybe you want community, maybe you want clarity maybe in things in life. And it seems like with these articles you shared especially, people are talking more about politics. Why are things a certain way, or why are that, or why are we being persecuted for believing a certain thing? And I never really, again, you could talk to him more than I can, but like, I never thought that was what you went to church for, was, again, the victimhood.
But, when you begin to feel like your faith is attacked, right? And in Christianity, right, like, as a Christian, within the church, a very common refrain is like, your identity shouldn't be in your job. Your identity shouldn't be in your family. It shouldn't be in your possessions. Your identity is in Christ, right? And it's in the Bible. You are born again in Christ. And so when your faith, Christianity, is attacked, it's your identity being attacked. And we talked about this kind of towards the end of the last podcast. I brought up, like, people's politics.
Right.
And in reading the articles for this and kind of refreshing those, one of the things that's talked about in one of these articles is that people that are leaving the church aren't changing their views politically like you would expect, because historically, as people left the church in kind of the Northeast and in Europe, what ended up happening is more progressive politics kind of came into vogue because people had left the churches that were swaying them towards a more conservative viewpoint. But what you're seeing now is instead that in the South, as people are leaving the church, that they're moving their identity from their faith into their politics, but they're not changing their politics.
Yeah.
So it was really eye-opening, because we've talked about it before, where I really feel like I just don't understand where, like, Christian nationalism and where this is coming from. And I think a couple months ago I talked even about this article, the first article, the Russell Moore one, that I had read, where he talked about people are coming to church and being like, why are you preaching that woke sermon, when it's literally what Jesus said?
Or like the Sermon on the Mount, and they're like,
yes, exactly.
And they're like, why are you being woke? And he's like, what are you talking about?
Right.
Yeah.
So
let me ask you, you briefly brought up Christian nationalism, and we've talked about, fascism and maybe Nazism. I forget the titles of all of our, I know we've talked
all
about
the isms.
Yeah, I think we always do stuff too where we're like, hey, we should talk about the pod, and then we're on the phone for an hour. So I don't know if it was a private conversation or not, but like, what do you think? You just alluded to the fact that it is troubling, this Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
This idea that, a lot of people, mostly on the left, will bring up that there's a lot of countries that are still functioning that are not predominantly Christian. You know what I mean? And so this idea that Christ has somehow just given us the American exceptionalism thing about we're exceptional, but
I mean, you go back to the founding of the country in the early days of the country, the whole concept of manifest destiny.
right.
Right? It's deeply ingrained in our society.
So let me, instead of just me saying things, let me ask you, what do you think is troubling for you reading these articles and coming to it the way you did in like Christian nationalism? Is it one of those things where you're like, how do we get out of this? Because it's like, how do you turn the boat? You know, not to use a biblical term, but I think it'd be really troubling. And what I find more troubling is, speaking more of politics, is when people leave. You know, when people are really on your side and they're like, well, I'm not going to seek re-election. Like the Mitt Romney thing we brought up last episode is one thing because he literally said I'm old, know. But like if I see somebody on one side of the aisle that I don't agree with, but they're staying there and willing to fight and speak up against Trump and all this stuff, but then they say, well, I'm going to leave. Like you're obviously not going to leave your faith, but he did, right? So to me, that's troubling. We have people that have these deep thinkers that are, trying to grapple with these like profound problems, and then they're like, I'm out. I've also heard of humanitarians leaving when it gets too much,
Yep.
and
I didn't share it with you, but a pastor friend of mine had shared a blog post from another pastor that talked about why he was leaving the church, and it was just getting too tiring and being attacked during COVID about not being strict enough or being too strict. And my last couple of churches, I didn't leave the church for a particular reason. My wife and I moved. We changed churches.
Right.
But in both of those churches, there was a lot of strife and struggle around COVID policies and what is and what isn't right, and where does that stand in our faith. And
did you guys have an older population at your church, so maybe they were a little bit more susceptible to
both churches, the former church and our current church, have kind of a mixed.
Yeah,
there's some older, some younger.
Yeah, I mean, you go to our COVID episode and watch what we thought about that, but you got vaccinated because it's like, I that's the one thing. I mean, not to bring up the vaccination thing too much, but it is weird when people talk so much about personal freedom. But like, I understand we want to be able to do what we want in this country, but at the same time, I believe that I have a responsibility to people around me, and we talked about that with the COVID episode.
Yeah,
and I think that even goes into like these articles with community and faith and like, hey, we're in this together, right, guys?
Right.
But it seems like some of these people...
And for me, that was one of the most befuddling things about how much Christians that I was going to church with were so vehemently against it. And I think that kind of speaks to sort of the Christian nationalism. Like, your identity and who you identify with politically outside of the church trumped your responsibility to your neighbor. I mean, one of the most powerful and most meaningful texts to me as a Christian is, they will know you by how you love each other. So for me, when I'm looking at churches and Christians, people who identify as Christian, that I'm not going to wear a mask, this is all a scam, without consideration of that mask makes the other person feel safe. I don't care if it is or isn't effective. It makes that other person feel safe.
I think there was this,
To put your inconvenience over your brother or sister in Christ's safety, for them to not feel safe to come to church and worship because you are so arrogant as to refuse to do something as simple as put a piece of cloth over your face. I don't care if it is or isn't effective.
Yeah.
That's arrogance.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be like really troubling when it's like, hey, wear a mask. And then I don't know about your church with the vaccines. You probably did distance, Zoom, whatever. But then when there was vaccines, it's like, hey, did they have any vax policy? This goes to a larger thing about whatever of like, did you have to show proof of being...
No. And here's the deal, right? Like, from my viewpoint, right? Like, our faith in Christ is preeminent over
slight inconvenience,
political viewpoints,
yeah,
over governmental rules and regulations,
yeah,
right? Like, that's any religion. I don't care what your faith is, right? Like, your faith typically is going to be preeminent over all of the other items, right? The whole idea of God, family, country, God's first.
Yeah.
That's not the case anymore.
Right.
And that was the really troubling part of, I don't remember which article it was, so I'm not going to cite it specifically. I know it wasn't the Russell Moore one, but they were citing specifically that it's going the other way. People are identifying as Christians, and I think I've brought this up, where they are they're hiding their political views behind their faith, but really their political views are informing their faith. So they're saying that I believe this because I'm Christian, but it's extra biblical. It's biblical. It's not actually anything that's in the Bible. They're just putting it behind it. And that's kind of the Christian nationalism movement as I see it. And it's very threatening because, one, it makes it far easier to attack the faith. All Christians are bad or evil because they're doing these nationalist things that are not beneficial to society at large, that they're really, really digging their feet in and getting extremely defensive and very aggressive. Not violently aggressive, but like sort of in your face aggressive.
Well, depending on
active. And in some cases violent, but by and large not. But that's what the world sees as a Christian now because they're the forefront. They're the ones in the news. They're the ones getting coverage. It's not the Christians that are loving one another. It's not the Christians that are out volunteering at pregnancy centers. It's not the Christians that are at food banks. It's not the Union Gospel Mission volunteers and employees that are like serving Christ in the community by helping one another. That are the face of Christianity anymore.
Have you talked to your pastor about this stuff? Or he's new, right? You're the new guy you got?
We have an interim pastor at the moment who like isn't up, so it's very difficult. But I can say that even he has called out Christian nationalism from the pulpit.
Wow, that's crazy. I mean, I'd imagine you were like, "Whoa!"
So the Russell Moore article here, I'll get the specifics up on it. So anyone who wants to read this can. The Russell Moore article is in the Atlantic. It's Russell Moore, published July 25th, 2023, and he calls it out flat out. He talks about talking to pastors that are having members come up to them after sermons and saying, "Why are you preaching this woke gospel?" I hate to say it, Christians. Jesus was woke by modern standards. Like, he cared about the weak and the oppressed and the marginalized. And in our society nowadays, if you're conservative, marginalized is a bad word.
Well, it's also, it seems like
it's a woke word.
Yeah, and it also seems like looking from the outside, the Christians are the one that feel marginalized. Like you said,
right?
It's like this cyclical thing where there's disagreement, sometimes violence, whatever. So that's what you see as a Christian. So then you bring that up to Christians, and they get offended,
right?
Or or they shut down any kind of debate or discussion,
right? And I hate to say it, but for me, right, like the difficult thing is like, as a Christian, it really troubles me that other people who identify as Christians that I would call brother or sister in Christ are the ones out there that aren't having grace for anyone. Like, there's fundamental disagreements. Our faith has some things in it that don't mesh with modern society, as does the Muslim faith, as does the Jewish faith,
right?
But the Abrahamic religions, as they say, right? But Christians aren't the ones out there that are having grace, trying to understand and like find common ground and helping and supporting these marginalized communities as well. And specifically, I'm thinking LGBTQ. No, they're out there attacking them. Now, Westboro Baptist is an extreme,
probably,
but that sort of started a lot of the sort of anti-Christian movement, in my opinion, because Westboro Baptist was out there being like, passing laws that allow gay marriage is why your city isn't doing well. What?
Yeah.
Like, where are you getting this from, guys?
Well, I even hear that. I mean, some of the podcasts. Well, I don't know if you totally listen to it, like the Valuetainment PBD, Patrick Bet David.
I'm familiar with it. I don't listen to him very often.
I've been listening to him more, but they even seem to be pushing back on a lot of stuff. And he's Christian because he talks about his faith. But I there's still this strange. It's weird because it's like the freedom.
Joe, I'm going to pause you for a second because I'm really distracted by this.
What,
you have some cat hair on your chin that's hanging and just sort of fluffing. You got it. All right.
Okay.
All right. Sorry. I want to actually hear what you're saying.
Yeah, not just stare at the cat hair, like zoom in on it.
He's never going to get it.
He's never going to get it. The wind's not going to take it away. Who's going to do that? Is a dog going to reach up and get it? No, I think that even for me looking from the outside, it is strange, this coupling of individual freedom and Christianity, because to me, those looking from the outside, those things don't really seem to go together, but they have been kind of slammed together. Because again, if Jesus, like you said, in the current definition is woke, and he really talks about, help your brother and all that kind of stuff. And then at the same time you go, well, government can't tell me what to do. I'm not wearing a mask.
Right.
I'm just going back to the COVID thing because that's like the most the newest example of
It's the
personal-
easiest one to
right.
call out to highlight the Christian nationalist sort of tribe.
Yeah,
now,
even-
they're not everyone, right? It's like
No.
some people have different viewpoints on it, but yeah.
I understand. I've heard things. I talked to a coworker when it was happening, and he said, "Well, I don't really want the government to force me to do it." And I said, "Well, they're not now.
Yeah.
Like our work isn't at the time. I just got the vaccine because I think it was I work around a lot of people,
Yeah.
and because I was in the shop at the time in our machine facility, and he kind of like really took that hard. He goes, I was like, and I just do it because it just right now gives me peace of mind. Now,
I mean, you have other reasons for it too, right? Like, even if you were to dig more deeply into it, I still think that you would be one that would be more inclined to be for it just because of family ties and obligations, right? Like, there's other health issues and stuff, people that you're around pretty commonly where, like, being more cautious is important. I have a very good friend, I don't think you know them, that had, like, very young, had a major heart surgery a few years ago.
wow.
And so they were, like, really up in arms about, like, go get vaccinated, people. Like, wear masks. Like, be careful. Because you would never look at them and know.
Yeah.
And, they had this, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was a major heart issue. They had to have surgery. It was, like, amazingly life-threatening. They're going to have to live with it for the rest of their life. And they were, like, 27 or 28. And so, yeah, they're totally up in arms about be careful about it. And you don't know. Like, you would never look at this person and be like, oh, wow, you have a pre-existing condition, right? Because we think of pre-existing conditions as like, oh, you're overweight, you're diabetic,
Right.
You have other health issues.
All the bad things.
Right.
Or the more visible things.
Right.
It is strange to me. I mean, especially with the American exceptionalism. I don't know if I stole the term, but I've just been thinking about it lately. I think it's really been biting us in the ass. Last episode, we talked about politics and how people are so entrenched in their beliefs they can't take a step back and say, "Oh, it's fine that you disagree with me. Do you want to go get coffee or whatever?"
Right.
I think the idea that we have to be the best, it's almost like we have to win at being a country, and I don't even know. I mean, everybody wants to think that their country is good. I get it. But I think
I hate to break it to most Americans, and if any of you that are listening are like buying into the American exceptionalism thing, like we grew up with it, and that's great. And I think America is a great country, and we have a lot of benefits, and we make it that way. Not our government, not the laws or the rules. Like we are the reason for that. And the greatest generation, World War II, the couple of decades following that, like we did amazing things. But I will also agree that progressive views and ideals and movements, I think, have stifled that. Now, is that necessarily a bad thing? In my opinion, yes. But it's not going to matter. We won't be the greatest nation on earth forever. And depending on how you measure it, we aren't already. We are the most productive nation in the world by a pretty large margin, but it won't be that way forever. The dollar is slipping in its influence. Countries are moving away from using the dollar as the reserve currency. Like it's not always going to be that way. And what are we going to do in our desperate attempts and clawing at trying to maintain that? Like, how are we going to hurt our country, our people, the world? I
mean, we're talking about religion, but I feel that sometimes when I hear people talk about old policies, tradition, especially fossil fuels, like all these old things. Where they talk about how it's, like we just need to drill. It does feel like this kind of like, hey, we know it's ending or whatever. We know it's towards the end, so let's just extract what we can out of it and be gone. Which, I mean, to talk about religion, one thing someone pointed out to me years ago, just about the Lord's Prayer, on earth as it is in heaven. This guy was a Jewish guy that converted to Christianity, and he said, I believe in that so much because the idea of like you can't have this farsightedness for the rapture or whatever you think's going to happen at the end or heaven. You have to really do a good job being a shepherd, which I heard there was I want to read about it, but I think it was Lyndon Johnson's vice president. Was it like a civil rights leader kind of? And he was Christian, and I guess he was really affected by, they called it the social gospel. it was like a Protestant thing. The idea of like what we're talking about no, you go to the community and make sure that they have clean drinking water and make sure that the roads are clean and like, you know, you try to help other people out so that way their community is better.
Yeah.
It wasn't about wealth. You know, it seems like nowadays it's like there's the seed gospel. Like if you give you've heard of that, like the prosperity gospel, the idea, if you give me $1, you'll get 20, you know, a year from now or whatever. And really it just seems like, and we've seen many examples, it's just a funnel to their bank account.
Right.
You know, and it's like the most, to use the words, marginalized or elderly people are falling victim to it.
Most at risk.
Yeah. Are like, oh, well, you know.
The most desperate.
Yeah.
Because they hear a message of hope that, like, there is a chance, right? It's the same thing as the lotto, right?
Yeah.
Tax on the poor, as it's sometimes called, right? Like, the lottery is that I'm desperate, I need something. At least if I shouldn't spend this money because I don't have very much money, but if I do that, it gives me the illusion that there's a chance that I can get out of this,
happen, yeah.
right? So, right, the big refrain from all three of the articles that we went through, right, is that Americans aren't necessarily disillusioned with their faith. They're leaving because life is too busy.
Oh.
And life is too hard, right? Like, you know, I'm trying to juggle taking care of my kids and working. I think the statistic in one of the articles was something like almost 30% of Americans have to work on Sundays because they work in restaurant or retail or other service industries. Where you have to be at work on the weekend. And so they're not able to go because work becomes preeminent, right? A lot of the conservatives that have left the church or aren't attending regularly still identify as Christian. Most of these people that aren't going because they're working still identify as Christian. Right. But they've now tied their identity into their politics because they're not at church anymore. And church, which used to offer this sort of like, hey, community is important. I mean, it still does. Right, community is important. Take care of one another. We should be doing this, and it was a counterpoint. It was a counterbalance to the conservative aspects of it. Was also the social aspects of it. Right. And now those people that are conservative that have stopped going to church are now losing that counterbalance, that thing to question them when they get a little bit too extreme.
I think some of it is too. You hear about a lot with people being very online or being, you know, plugged in all the time of like just being on the internet and kind of being like loneliness, and especially with men is a thing.
Right.
And like that idea of, you know, the thing we used to do after church. And yes, I'm glad you're sitting down. Yes, I did go to church when I was young. The idea was after the sermon and everything. Yeah, you did actually have coffee with people afterwards.
Have coffee, go
cake.
Out to lunch.
Yeah. You would sit there and
stand
talk
in the foyer and talk.
Yeah, and that was, I mean, I was young. And I always looked forward to that because it was like, oh, I get to, and you, like, I found out weird things about the people in that congregation. Like, somebody just made soap by hand, and I just asked them questions about making soap because I was like, wait, soap?
Did they make explosives?
No, they weren't. It wasn't Tyler Durden. That would have been a big black eye. But you found stuff about that, or like somebody did crochet pretty amazing and would like give stuff to people like around the holidays. And it's like all this kind of stuff of like you just find out about the people around you. It's again, it's about community. It's like, oh, I have to be there for them because they're here for me, or vice versa. You can no longer just go home or whatever, or you know. And I'm sure your church does events too to have. Hey, we're going to do a bake-off, or we're going to do, you know.
Well, there's fellowship events.
Yeah.
So fellowship is just bringing the people together to spend time together, right?
Yep.
Fun events.
Yeah.
Going out and doing barbecues,
as it
doing
should
birthday parties, getting to know one another. Right. My particular church, we meet in the evenings currently, and that's going to change next month, I think. But because we were kind of forced into a situation where we had to meet in evenings because we were sharing space with another church, we lost our building, which was because the building we were renting from was like, hey, we're going to raise your rent 40%.
Was it a church or was it an actual home?
No, we had a building that we were renting. So I don't want to be like, a church kicked us out or anything else. Like, so that's the only reason I wanted to
freaking
spell that out. So, like, right now, for fellowship purposes, we do a dinner before every service. So we meet early.
Oh, you do it before.
And we have a dinner beforehand. And then after that, we have the service. And we do that because families with young children need to get their kids home and get them in bed, right? You know, our service ends typically around 6:30 or 7. You've got your kids there at church, and a lot of kids are in bed at 7, 8 o'clock at
Yeah,
night.
young kids, yeah.
So we did an early dinner, and then we have our service. So we have dinner at 4:30. We have our service at 5:30.
That's perfect. My wife and I are getting way older than we look, and dinner at 4:30 is great.
Okay.
Everybody makes fun of us. We're like, it's perfect.
But that time is a great time for us to get together and chat and like break bread, literally.
Yeah. Well, that was the point, I think.
Yeah. And so,
I mean, I'm not even religious, but Jesus sitting down and having a meal with somebody, he's like, hey, tell me about your day.
you know, when you ask the question of like,
That's not
what
a
do
direct
people
quote from the Bible, by the way. I don't think Jesus ever said that. Hey, man, tell me about your day.
I mean, he probably did.
Yeah.
Just
It wasn't
didn't
quoted.
get put down in the Bible.
Yeah, they're like, I'm not going to write that one down.
Right. So, I mean, you were talking about like people, what do they get out of it, right? And all throughout humanity, there's a common frame of spirituality, right? And it doesn't matter where you live and what point in history, spirituality is a giant part of the human creature.
Yeah. Well, even for like atheists or whatever, the idea of you're still looking for meaning. you
Right.
know? Yeah.
And so,
And Ben Shapiro would say that you can't get as high on the ladder if you're not religious, which that's his belief. But that doesn't mean you still whatever. It doesn't discount people trying to look for whatever, I think.
right. So that's interesting. I'm curious why he says that.
I'll send you the link for that if you want to sit for it, or at least you got to drive home.
Yeah.
So you got to drive home. I just listen to it or whatever. But like I said, it's fascinating for anybody to say, here's how my brain works.
Yeah.
And you're like, whoa.
So, right, like this movement of people leaving the church, like they're not getting that anymore. They're not in community anymore with people that they respect, that are willing to question them when they say something that might be a little bit off kilter,
Yeah,
right?
to me, that is the grief of politics. The idea that you have something that means something deeply profound and like spiritual, like we were just talking about,
Yeah.
and you're not participating anymore for political reasons.
And for some people, it is
Or
political,
busyness,
right?
you know,
And
yeah.
the Russell Moore article, kind of the things he's talking about, like people are leaving the church because the pastors become woke.
Yeah.
That's not good. People are leaving the church because the pastors become a Nazi. I'm going to say that because that's what a lot of liberals define conservatives as.
Well, there was
Or fascists.
There was a neo-Nazi gathering in Florida the other week, but that's fine. Like they actually had flags, so you're like, ooh, those are Nazis. Like they got flags,
Right.
in a public park.
But, you know, the majority of people are just sort of drifting away because church isn't maybe offering them any value anymore, or it's not worth the time, effort, energy to go anymore. And that's pretty sad. The other article that I was talking about, the one that actually really does discuss, Christian nationalism, they say, or not say, the title of that article, it's in the Atlantic as well, is What Really Happens When Americans Stop Going to Church. People hold on to their politics when they stop attending church is the subtitle, and it's by Daniel K. Williams, published September 3rd of 2023. The very first sentence, millions of Americans are leaving church, never to return, and it would be easy to think that it will make the country more secular and possibly more liberal. But as he goes on to discuss, like that's actually not the case.
Right.
And then what is it? One of the other things in here that really stood out, right? It seems clear that Christian nationalism attracts a lot of adherents who rarely go to church themselves. Yet it has become sort of the face of Christianity, and I've been talking about it for a while, and so this was really eye-opening for me. This is, like I said, it really resonated because I was like, man, like, it just doesn't make any sense. And then they say a PRI survey published earlier this year showed that only 54% of Christian nationalists and just 42% of those who are sympathizers with the ideology attend church regularly, while it's still significantly higher than the rate of church attendance among the general population, which is only 28%. If I remember correctly, that's down from 40% a decade ago.
So it's just shrinking.
Yeah, like starkly. They go on to talk about like from COVID, where it happened, how it worked. They talk about other stuff along here, but that was the really sort of stark standout thing to me. And then
It's have you noticed it at your congregation, like fewer people?
at my church, no. I mean, there's people that have moved away, but they're still going to be in their churches, right? But my church, in particular, shrank a lot during the pandemic because there was division over mask or not mask, and then there was drama.
You did Zoom stuff though during the.
Our former church did, right? Like we met over Zoom and did like a congregational live stream. We didn't do Zoom. We live streamed over YouTube. And then we started meeting in person outside as soon as we possibly could, and they opened it up to allow us to do that. And then back inside as soon as we could as well, which was good timing because it was starting to get cold outside. In the summer, it was hard because it was hot.
Yeah.
The both of those churches, though, had their own drama around COVID because should be doing more, should be doing less. The stresses and tension caused other things to bubble to the surface, right? And the best part about the church, about the faith, is the people.
Yeah.
The worst part about the church and the faith.
I knew you were going to say, as soon as you said that, I was like, here we go.
Right. And it, because we all have different opinions and we all think we're right and we all hold them very tightly. And then unfortunately, like Christians just aren't showing grace to one another. And it's depressing.
Do you guys have like, I disagree with the church my dad went to before he passed, but they did do things where they did like a history thing. So they would talk about like the Mennonites, and then they would like relate it to kind of like modern history or something. And I thought that was fascinating. I know you guys have obviously Bible study and things like that. Do you guys do that of like, here's this thing that happened in history and here's how it equates to now? Like maybe they could start talking about, the pastor could, because you said he's called out white nationalism and stuff like that.
Christian
nationalism. Hopefully he will call it white nationalism as well. But maybe he needs to do, I mean, it's a lot, but maybe the after hours things of, hey, we really need to like talk about this. Like what are you guys expecting out of church? And this is what I see.
So from our current church perspective with what's going on, right? So mid part of 2022 at my current church, the pastor stepped down, moved away, took a role with another church in Texas. For those of you that don't know, we live in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, PNW, baby.
Yeah. Joe on the south end in Tacoma area, and I'm on the north end in the Everett area.
Yeah.
But we're both still about 30 miles away from Seattle.
Yeah. Which is crazy.
So when our pastor stepped down, right, it was kind of driven by politics related to COVID. There had been some conflict between him and the other pastor of that church.
Right.
And we started going after this all happened. And so the other pastor left, and it was very contentious. And with him, a bunch of members of the church left too.
Oh.
And then the other pastor stepped down ultimately because he was like, hey, there's people here who still don't trust me, and I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's right for you as a congregation to have a pastor that you don't trust.
Yeah, that's not.
And so, like, I'm gonna leave and let you guys find a new pastor. So right now we have an interim pastor. We're part of an association. We're part of the Northwest Baptist Convention, and
Baptist.
The Northwest Baptist Convention has a big network of resources and people, and one of those is a pastor that helps with church plants, and so he's been stepping in as our pastor. Mm-hmm. So he lives in the South End. Mm-hmm. He lives in the Federal Way area, which is about 20 miles south of Seattle. It's important because traffic in the Northwest is terrible.
Yeah, anybody that lives on the I-5 corridor knows.
And our church is in Everett, so he's commuting up there, preaches at his church in the morning, then comes up and preaches at our church. And then the church that we're borrowing space from, like their pastor got a job offer close to family, and so he left.
So it's a big mess, basically.
So the same pastor is also helping them because they're part of the same network. So we're probably going to end up merging. But in that process, right, like we as a church collectively went through a whole process of meeting regularly as a body outside of regular hours and outlining like what is important to us. What does it look like for us for church to be as a congregation? What does it mean for us in our community? What are we looking for in a pastor? Where are our weaknesses? Where are our strengths? What are we looking for? Everybody meet Link.
What does Link need when he goes to congregation?
So yes, we have sat down and actually asked those questions recently. Most churches probably can't say that because they're sort of going through the motions and trying to keep the doors open. And right? Most churches are kind of struggling financially. Not all of them, but most. Most churches are struggling to find enough volunteers. Again, the article I just cited, they talk specifically about. Actually, no, I think it was the other article, the one that you sent me. That one was a New York Times, or no, it was a Wall Street Journal article titled "Why Middle-Aged Americans Aren't Going Back to Church."
Right.
This is the one that specifically called out the people in their late 30s, 40s raising kids that are really, really busy, and it kind of goes into the statistics.
Those are the ones that have the graphs and everything.
Yep. This is written by Claire Ansbury on August 1st of 23. So in here, I believe they bring up the statistic that, churches are now having a super hard time getting people to volunteer. And because people that are going to church are still like, oh, well, then I got to go home and make dinner, or I got to go wash laundry, and they're trying to manage their lives. And so volunteers have pulled back, and people got out of the habit of churching during the pandemic because you couldn't go to church. You're going to church less. You were being safe, or just like the church itself wasn't open. You couldn't go.
Yeah.
So it's had a really major impact across the board, and there's a bunch of different factors sort of going into it. And all of these articles were very interesting to me. And they all resonate because, as I've talked about before, like it really, really does grieve me that, one, this is how we identify Christianity as a nation, because the Christian nationalism is taking over, and two, because like it doesn't align with my understanding of the gospel, of the Bible, of the teachings of Jesus. Right? I am a pretty conservative person. Yes, I will say, and did say, Jesus is woke. I'm sorry to say it to you, but Jesus is also conservative.
It's coming for everybody.
Right? Like, he is both. One of my favorite pastors, I attended his church briefly when I was living in Texas, is a guy by the name of Matt Chandler. And again, not perfect. He's had his own controversy in the last couple of years. But one of Matt's favorite things to do in sermons is he brings up points in the Bible that are kind of counterposed, and he was like, well, which one are we supposed to believe? Yes, and. Because both things can be true.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, like, it has become so toxic to have any socially supportive viewpoint. That's wokeism in our culture in America for conservatives, that like you're not a Christian if you don't have that grace. But I don't know that I necessarily want to call people out on their faith because I don't know them. I just feel like maybe they're getting led astray, or they've lost community to call them out and to question them because they're now only associating with their own echo chamber, that we've become to love that phrase so much. Or
I mean, it is true.
Right? That they're no longer being questioned.
Excuse me.
Gesundheit.
Have you ever, like during the Bible study or whatever, brought stuff like this up? Not just a pastor, like, you do group things. Obviously, you're like, hey, everybody, this has just been rattling around in my head. Just thought I'd bring it up to the group.
I haven't lately. Well, actually, I haven't ever. But, lately we also haven't been really having a space where we would do that. We usually stop our weekly home gatherings, small group, home group, whatever you want to call it. There's different names for it. We usually stop those in the summer because people are traveling, taking vacation, doing stuff with their kids. Right.
Summer vacation.
So we're about to start that back up again, and this wasn't as big of an issue for me before. And typically those events, right, like we're getting together and doing some fellowship. Normally we'll have a meal, and then we're either doing a Bible study where we're doing like a book study or Bible study directly. And then a lot of the times we're just praying with each other, right? Like, what's going on in your life? What do you need prayer for? What do you need help with? What do you need support with? And that prayer part, that how can we pray for you, it usually consumes the majority of the time that's not fellowship time. And so
I know
that's really the day-to-day life for people, not the existential questioning.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying there's not value in it. Honestly, I think there is value in it.
Right. I just think it's got to be rough, like someone in your position. I mean, you said it before, but like, so people see some kind of either violent disagreement or actual violence, and they think that's what Christians are. Mm-hmm. And so, what are we going to do? What is going to happen? And how do you approach? Like, do you go to your pastor and say, "What do we do?" Because, like, I believe.
I think it's smaller than that. I mean, honestly, if we want to make a change, if we want to see improvement, I think it's much smaller than that, right? Major change doesn't happen at, and the Russell Moore article, I think, calls it out too, because that I didn't title that article, but
wow.
The title of that article is "The American Evangelical Church is in Crisis. There's only one way out." And he specifically cites it. Basically, it's got to be kind of in the local churches, and it's got to be in the local communities, and it's got to be people talking to one another. I believe that's what it was anyway. That's my viewpoint, even if that's not his. Big, huge, giant movements aren't going to do it. Big, giant political movements aren't going to do it. That's what got us in this space. Like, we have to interact with one another. One of my biggest reasons that I am conservative versus progressive is, like, so much of the progressive movement is the government needs to do things to make things better. And so much of my viewpoint is, no, we need to do things to make things better.
I think what you said is true, but I think there is a reason for that. But anyway, we're talking about the church.
But it applies in the church context too, right? Like, people really want there to be a big, huge movement, right? There's been a lot of discussion about, I can't even remember it at the moment. There's a big revival going on at some university earlier this year, and everyone was getting around it in Christian circles, and that's great. But revival isn't the solution. The solution, I mean, unless that revival is like in your local church.
Oh yeah, there was an article I didn't share with you. It said, or maybe I got it this morning on my newsfeed because I've been looking at all these. It said, Christians will have to choose either revivalism or evangelicalism, but they can't have both.
I'd be interested to read that.
Yeah, I gotta see if I can find it again.
Yeah.
I just think this episode turned more into an interview, but I am true. Well, if somebody's Christian, you're like, let's talk about Christianity. You wouldn't be like, well, anyway.
Yeah.
But I do think it's a unique thing, and I don't envy you to have to, like, does it make you still want to, like, go to church? Do you still want to interact with people, or are you getting to the point where you're like,
I don't experience a lot of this at my church.
Oh, okay.
I actually, we've got a smaller congregation. Everyone's pretty close. There are very little disagreements. I know there are people in the church that are pretty conservative that were probably leaning towards being sort of pro-Trump. But politics don't really come up a whole lot at church, at my church. And I think the body that stayed behind after the drama is probably the ones that stayed behind because they really, truly
for the right reasons
want to follow Jesus and believe in the gospel. And so they're willing to have grace and recognize that maybe their viewpoints are going to be contentious, and so they're not pushing them. Because I know some who have voiced enough of their viewpoint to know that they're pretty conservative, and they sort of agree with some of the viewpoints that you would hear in the more right-leaning news organizations.
Right.
But never once have I ever heard any of them come out and be like, oh, you got vaccinated? What's wrong with you, you sheep?
Sheeple. Yeah.
And yet, I know I have at least one friend who would view the fact that I got vaccinated as being a sheep. Now, no, they don't believe that. But I would suspect it because I know their other viewpoints. And I know that they don't believe that because I've talked about it. And they haven't said that to me.
Another thing, too, I think is, I think you said, too, and I mean, it happened during COVID and other times in my life where you'd see a Facebook post for somebody and it would be what you would consider to be, like, unhinged. Where you'd be like, where did this come from?
Right.
And then, like, if you're going to church with these people, you're like, well, I guess I don't have to bring it up. But still, now I know where Dave stands or whatever, you know, where you're like, great.
Yep. And for me, right, and part of the reason we do this whole podcast is to understand where the other person comes from, right? Mm-hmm. And so
I'll say that I was thinking about actually the podcast with you and I a lot, and I thought about that, like, you even when you don't agree with stuff, you're like, this is how this is. And I'm like, really? All right. But it doesn't mean that I'm like, yeah, but it's dumb. I'm just like, that hurts. I wish it wasn't like that. But, damn. I don't know, man. I think...
Interesting. Now I know. Now I want to know where you're like, that hurts.
I think... Oh, I can tell you exactly what it was. It isn't really on topic, but it's about the profit sharing with corporations. Where, you said the fiduciary responsibility goes to the shareholders.
Right now, currently, the way the SEC is
but
set up.
I don't think you're happy with that either. I think it's just, it's how the system is.
Correct.
So I don't like it, but it's how the system is.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes you view everything else like, okay, that's why they're not doing this. That's where they're not hiring more people or getting machinery. They're buying their stock back so they can all get dividends or whatever.
I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I am saying it is how it's set up.
Yeah, and I think, when you and I talked about that, I was like, man, that sucks.
I think you and I had already talked about, like, we kind of want to do another podcast on and talk about unions on that end of it. So, guys, be looking forward to a podcast sometime in the near future on unions.
It's going to be great. There's so much actually to talk about. I mean, so many things have unionized the United Auto Workers went on strike, and I just heard, I don't know if you heard, but Marvel, some of their VFX people are unionizing now. They agreed to unionize. So it wasn't, they were talking about it now, and they said it's the first time that's ever happened in history, which is pretty crazy. So, well, yeah, it was a good episode. Thanks for talking to me about church and such.
Yeah.
Because I know sometimes it's like, I don't know, do I want to talk about this? I guess.
Yeah, I sort of dominated this one a little bit, but like you said, it was more of an interview format.
No, it's fine, because, again, you're a Christian, so, like, why would I not be like, let me tell you, Avin, what Christianity's like in the, you know what I think? You're wrong. Yeah, that's it. If you like the podcast, please like, subscribe, share it with people.
Please.
Friends, families.
Comment.
Yeah.
Anything. Agree, disagree, right?
Yeah. Even if you do the frowny face emoji, still a comment.
We do this because we want to understand better. So if you've got another viewpoint, the counterpoints, or something else that we missed, we would love to hear it.
You'll love to hear it. Yeah. A little engagement good. Also, podcast comes out the 20th of every month. Podcast services, Apple, iTunes, Google Play Store, Spotify. The video on YouTube will go up 7 a.m. the 20th in the morning. Spotify will hit in the evening. Again, I have to make sure that sometimes there's errors and I have to keep re-uploading. It's Spotify. They're like, how many viewers you got? We don't care. Just keep uploading it till it works.
What? You didn't get a giant multi-million-dollar deal when you put your podcast up?
I'm the other Joe. One of the Joes got a multi-million-dollar deal to do a podcast. I'm the other one that didn't. There's so many of us. But that's it this month. I don't know what I'm going to talk about next month. You're going on vacation for a bit, so we'll probably decide when you get back what to do. But yeah, that's it for this month, and we will talk to everybody again next month.